I want to talk to us about what it looks like to just empower everyday believers. Because for the majority here, we're everyday believers. And I think in the church, one of the biggest issues we've had with mission is not just our model, but it's like our picture of ourself and what we're capable of. And I think what we've done is we've radically lowered the bar of what we think is possible, right? And one of the things that made me think about this, when we moved down to Florida, my kids started getting into skateboarding, right? And you know how kids are. My kids are 9, 7, and 5. So you know how kids go. They get like super excited about something. They want to dive totally in. You buy the equipment, and then they've moved on, right? And so they start getting into skateboarding, and in Florida, because the temperature's always so warm, there are some insanely cool skate parks. Like the big skate parks with like the huge bowls that look like pool, like the stuff you see on the X Games kind of stuff. And my kids are starting to skateboard in those. And they had these little old school, they look like they were made in the 1970s skateboards that we got from Walmart. And so they're skating in there, and they're like, man, these are just kind of, like we need some better skateboards. And I'm like, all right, you're skating a bunch. I'm kind of enjoying this. So my mother-in-law found out a flea market sold some really legit looking skateboards for like $20 a pop. And like 3 kids, I'm like, that's in the budget. So we go to this skate park, we get these skateboards, and they look like the really good skateboards, right? And so they're skating, and they skate on them for about a month, and their skating's improving, and they're having fun. And then we're driving to the skate park one day, and my kids look from the back seat, and they go, hey, Dad, could we get some new boards? And I was like, you've been doing this like a month. And I was like, I'm not going to be like, no, we just bought these. I'm a teaching opportunity, right? So I look back and I say, hey guys, here's the deal. You don't always need a new thing to get better. Like until you've maxed out the capacity of that thing that you're using, and until it's the thing that's holding you back from what you could do next, like just keep using those boards. Now, what did I think? I was pretty sure this settled the conversation for a while, right? We show up to the skate park, and they're trying what's called a drop-in. And a drop-in is this. You get a board up to the edge, because you know all these things have the steep, like, bowls and stuff like that. And so you get your board up to the edge, and you put, like, the tail of the board on it, and the front of the board's there, and then you just push it down, and you literally drop down. And gravity does the rest, right? And it's a pretty critical skill if you want to do things like half pipes and stuff that would literally just break me, okay? And they're sitting there practicing these, and they're getting close. They keep falling at the bottom. And I didn't grow up skateboarding, so I didn't know what to do. But the cool thing about the skate park, it's kind of a community. And so I see these guys skateboarding that are really good. Turns out they're like semi-pro skateboarders. And I go over and I'm like, hey, can you help my kids figure out the skateboarding thing? So they go over, and they're showing them the drop-in, and they're helping them. They're doing the handhold. They're showing them what to do with the board. And then one of them, he goes, well, hey, give me your board here. I'll show you. And he takes the board, and he holds it for like 2 seconds. Not even 2 seconds. And he goes, Dad? And I was like, yeah. He goes, come here. And so I walk over. He goes, so they're not going to be able to do this on these boards? They need a better board. And you could see my kids in the background just smiling like ear to ear. They're like, we told you. So later that week, my brother-in-law is like, I'd love to take the kids to the skate park and the skate store. I'm like, you take them to the skate store. So he takes them to the skate store, buys them the better board. So I think I won on that instance. And it's like once they had the better board, they were instantly able to do it. And it changed what they were able to do at the skate park. And it was not because they couldn't do it. It was because they had the wrong board. They just needed a better board. And I think for us in the church, it's really similar. It's not that we can't do this stuff, because it's very simple. And as we see from the wall, God's put the opportunity all around us. I think what we need is just a better picture of church, the same way that my kids needed a better board. And so yesterday we talked about what that picture is, right? The picture is the picture of the church that goes out. And when the church goes out, what happens? when we're in that missional mindset, all of a sudden the church springs up in all these other places. But we still feel like, as we said earlier, there's this leap there. And we're like, what's that leap? Well, let me start by giving you a better board. And so what we're going to look at, you just remember we just read this passage, right? We read about the church in Antioch. And here's the amazing thing about the church in Antioch. The church in Antioch changed everything. The church in Antioch was the first really big Gentile church, right? The church in Antioch is not just the first place that we were called Christians. The church in Antioch was actually the church that launched Paul out on his missionary journeys. So the church in Antioch is the reason that you have the majority of the New Testament you're reading. Because the majority of the New Testament you're reading is a lot of letters that Paul wrote to a lot of those churches that he started. But here's the interesting thing about the church in Antioch. We don't know who specifically started it. Because it was started by average, ordinary, anonymous Christians. Church in Antioch was started that way. Church in Rome was started that way. Church in Antioch was where the Gentile church became big. And all of a sudden we learned that, hey, the church, as Jesus was saying, is not just for the Jewish people, it's for all people. And the church in Antioch is the first place that started to really explode big time. And so it's the church in Antioch. But when you were reading that story, something really interesting stuck out, right? And it was the fact that you had these anonymous Christians, and they were out, and they were running. Why? Because they were being persecuted. Like they literally could not stay in their home and still believe and worship Jesus. So what did they do? They went on the run. And as they're going out to these other places, what does it say? It says they get to these new communities and they start talking first with the people that they're comfortable with, right? Like the other Jews. And so they're speaking to these other people in the communities. And it makes sense because if you're somebody that moves from another country or another culture, you will tend to, when you move to a new spot, gravitate towards those that are more like you, that you kind of understand because there's a comfort there. There's a cultural comfort, especially as you're trying to get integrated into this new culture. And so they're talking to the Jewish people. They're sharing why they're on the move. They're sharing about Jesus, which is amazing, right? Because you'd think if I was persecuted over here for this, I should probably kind of keep it quiet over here, but they just couldn't do that. The gospel was something they couldn't keep quiet. And so they're over here sharing the gospel. They're speaking to other Jews. And then there's a couple men from Cyprus and Cyrene who have this radical idea. They see these other people over who were from Antioch, who were Hellenists, so not Jewish, and they were preaching the Lord Jesus to them. And it says all of a sudden, verse 21, and the hand of the Lord was with them, and a great number who believed turned to the Lord. So what happened? They literally started preaching the word to them. And all of a sudden, these people who were not like them, they realized maybe they need the gospel too. They share the gospel with them, and it catches like wildfire. And the church in Antioch is born. It explodes so big that the church in Jerusalem is like, we have to send reinforcements, right? Can you imagine a church just exploding out of nowhere in Vancouver, right? And all of a sudden, the Lutheran Church in Canada is like, this thing's grown out of nowhere. We have no clue how it happened. We got to send in reinforcements to help. You know, it's grown that big. Like, that's a cool thought, right? That's what happened. But here's the interesting thing that sticks out to me. It's this word, speaking, spoke, and preaching, right? Because when we're looking at this, these words, like we said, words kind of create a picture. These words give us a picture. And when we hear that word preach, what's the picture we have? The picture we have when we hear that word preach is this guy, the pastor, right? You sit there and you hear that word and you're like, this training is for Pastor James and Pastor Matt. He just wants the rest of us to watch, right? Because they talked about preaching and that's who preaches. But you know what? I think this is one of those instances where understanding what the word is really talking about would really help us out a lot. Because when this word preaching, it kind of comes from this like evangelize word, right? Or the gospel word. So you're gospeling somebody, okay? And so really, the way you could translate it is actually like this. You could translate it as announce, proclaim, or just told. So really, we're not talking about preaching like you would experience in the middle of a worship service. We're talking about people that are just sharing something they've experienced with somebody else. And I was talking to my friend Trey about this, the guy that helped co-create the Missionary Pathway stuff. And he's like, it's a lot more like a couple guys sitting over the grill talking to their neighbor, right? Like they've moved into town, they've been there a little bit, all of a sudden they're getting to know their neighbors, so they have a cookout together, right? And they're sitting there, the guys hang out by the grill, because that's what guys do in any and every culture, right? And they're sitting there talking, they're like, hey, so why'd you move here? Oh, yeah, we moved here because we were being persecuted in Jerusalem. Really? What were you being persecuted for? We were being persecuted for Jesus. Who's Jesus? Let me tell you, he's a game changer. And so they start sharing that, just a conversation, but it's a conversation that changes everything. How does it change it for you when you realize one of the most impactful churches in the New Testament was started by a few people having a conversation? Not professional church workers. They didn't come in till later, right? They came in because things were exploding with growth and people needed some more help. So we're like, we'll send those guys in. They came in after. It was just ordinary people sharing their life and their faith with other people in ordinary spaces. The same way if you moved to a town, you'd be like, oh, why'd you move here? What do you think of the neighborhood? You like the park over there? Who's Jesus? Oh, let me tell you. It's that kind of thing. It's a conversation in a very normal and average setting. And this is the incredible thing about the gospel in Scripture. God does extraordinary things in ordinary places. Like, this is the whole story of the Bible. I remember right before the pandemic, I got a chance to go on a clergy interest tour, and I invited my dad, not a pastor. He had just retired, and I'm like, hey, do you want to go to Israel with me? He just retired, got a new knee. He's like, that sounds fun. So we fly to Israel, and I'm thinking, man, I can't wait to see this. This is going to be an insane experience. I spent so much time studying the Bible. It's going to be amazing. And one of the spots I really wanted to see was the spot where David fought Goliath, right? I was like, this is going to be so cool. So day one, we get off the plane after like a 12-hour trip, and we get to go to the place where David fought Goliath. And I was like, yes. That was the most underwhelming experience of my life. It was like a rocky farmer's field, and it was not that impressive. And I had a few of those moments on this trip where I'm like, the thing I expected would be so cool was this underwhelming experience. And I'm starting to like look around Israel, and I'm like, Israel is not much bigger than New Jersey. Like, I've been to a lot of places. Like, I'm sitting here in Vancouver staring at these amazing mountains, right? You go to Israel, and it's like, little hill, and then big little rocky space, and you're like, I miss it, And then all of a sudden it dawned on me. God took an ordinary place, and in my estimation at that moment, a less than ordinary place. And he chose to do an extraordinary thing that changed the world, right? Like, that's how God works. He works in the less than ordinary spaces, doing extraordinary things. He works in the less than ordinary people, doing extraordinary things. Because then at the end of the day, who gets the credit? We don't. God does. Like, that's how God works. But I think sometimes what happens is we get so far away from it, and we get so ingrained in it, and we build so many practices that are designed to help us grow in that faith that start to become our worship rhythm and our discipleship rhythm in church, that we forget this is how God does it. And so we start to think God only does extraordinary things in extraordinary places. And we forget that, no, God moves in a very different way. Ordinary people, ordinary places, doing extraordinary things because of the extraordinary God they're connected to. And so as we talk about this, this is the heart of it. This is why sometimes when we talk about making a big leap, part of the reason we talk about making a big leap is because we still have extraordinary places, extraordinary things in our mind, and we still look in the mirror and go, ordinary. But the reality is, God does the best things through the ordinary, through the people that don't feel like they're equipped to do what God's calling them to do. So, take a little time at your table right now and kind of discuss what you hear God saying to you in this moment. So here are 3 questions you could use. What stuck out to you as we talked about this? So what stuck out to you in this session? What challenged you? And what would it look like for you to put some of these concepts you hear God talking about into practice? So go ahead and take about 5 minutes to discuss at your table some of the things that you're hearing, and then we'll take some time together to ask questions.
The question was, what do you do with people who are totally belligerent or don't want to hear anything or listen to anything?
Oh, great question. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. But what I would say is, and I'm glad I got a chance to actually come out early and like drive around Vancouver. I noticed you all have stoplights just like we do. This is a good thing, right? And they operate pretty similar to the ones ours do, right? Red, yellow, green. Red means what? Stop. This is good. I'm concerned about the driving over here, but over here I think we're going to be good. Yellow means what? Speed up, right? Make it. Right. Yellow means the red's coming, so you've got a decision point, right? You either speed up or you slow down, and you have to decide what. There's not like a hard and fast rule. And then green means what? Go. Drive through. So think about spiritual conversations and people like stoplights. So you're going to have people that are clearly giving you a red signal when it comes to spiritual conversation, right? Like you said, the belligerent person. And so that's somebody that you just don't force the spiritual conversation in that moment. Because just like blowing through a red light, chances are it does more damage than it does good. But sometimes you've got people that are kind of putting up a yellow. And that yellow light is maybe this is a conversation we could have. Maybe it's not. You be the judge. You can even like kind of casually bring it up, and then if it's not something that you move forward with, you don't go through, right? It's a yellow light. Maybe you go, maybe you don't. And then some people are just giving you the flat out green light. And in that case, you go through. You have the conversation. And so think of people like stoplights, but then 2, don't put the onus on yourself. And we're going to talk about that a lot more later. I think sometimes we blow through the red light because we feel like if we don't have this conversation, we've failed God, right? Here's the reality. God has not tasked you with being the only person that brings somebody to faith. He's just tasked you with being present and willing. And so if the red light's up, God's telling you this is not the moment, right? And 2 stories stick out. My friend Trey, who is the one that helped co-create a lot of this stuff, Trey he grew up a pastor's kid, had some pretty healthy church wounds from that, and so he left the faith for a while. Went on to try to become a rock star, got almost famous twice. He actually led a band that opened for the Allman Brothers on tour. If you've ever heard Trey play the guitar, and you play the guitar even a little bit, you will quit. Because you realize you will never be that good at guitar, right? He's just amazing, right? But the touring musician thing was almost over, and he was trying to figure out what to do next. And apparently, touring musician is not a huge resume builder for a lot of other jobs. So he ends up in this really big Baptist church teaching music lessons. And he thinks to himself, it's cool, it's a job. I'm doing music, and I know the language I'm supposed to talk. when I'm in church, even though he wasn't connected to or living like he was in church. And here's what happened to Trey over the next couple of years. He was loved really well by the people around him. Like, people just would get him Christmas presents at Christmas time and let him know when they were thinking about him. And all of a sudden, that loving relationship started moving him toward faith. And then eventually he got reconnected to Jesus there. And then eventually started leading worship, and eventually ended up at the point, and my life changed forever. He's amazing, right? But you know what was interesting? He said in that experience, 2 times in that experience, I had people, even though I was putting up the red light, that felt like they had to have the spiritual conversation with me, or they were kind of failing God. And in both instances, you know what he said? It was a church staff person, right? Because we're like, this is my job, this is what I believe, I have to share it, right? And he said those instances weren't helpful. So I think realize if somebody's like that belligerent, like, I don't want to talk about this, it's okay. Because they're around you, they may still want to be in relationship with you. And you never know when that might change. Like I have a friend, Mitch, he was in Knoxville, used to grow up in the faith, now not at all. But we hung out around music because we both love Collective Soul because they're one of the greatest rock bands of all time. And you can debate that, but it's not really a debate. And so we had this love for, and so we just started connecting around music, right? And he knew I was a pastor, and we would have these spiritual conversations. And you know what he said to me? He said, I like having conversations with you because I respect you and you respect me. And you're not trying to force me into believing something, whether I should believe it or not. Other times, he likes to try and prove Christians wrong, right? He would be that person that sometimes would sit down and be the belligerent one, right? But because of that relationship, at one point, Mitch and I and a bunch of our friends are sitting in a bar doing a Bible study because we had that relationship. So I would say just always look for that stoplight. Because if you look for the stoplight, that'll be a really key indicator of what to do. Yeah, great question. Any other questions in this session?
So I have 2 questions, and they might have to be dealt with separately. One question is, a lot of young people or people sort of get really involved in the Anabaptist movement, and so how, as Lutherans, for a lot of people that's weird. Like, what's a Lutheran, right? So how do you sort of deal with that Anabaptist leaning where they completely reject a lot of things that we Lutherans stand for, yeah? That would be my first question. And my second question is, how far do you as a, in what you're talking about, become like the people that you're ministering to in order to attract them to the gospel? And I'm talking then more specifically, when doing a church service, for instance, and how far should the preacher then stand there in flip-flops and baseball cap, because to make so that he looks more like everybody else in order to hopefully, the thinking is attract people, or do we do what we've as Lutherans always done and hope that and teach people? I guess so that would be 2 separate questions.
Oh yeah, no, definitely. That's really good. Yeah, so 2 really good questions, by the way. Okay, so let's deal with the first question first. And let's start with like a chicken and egg kind of response. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? Except it's going to be much easier than that. Which came first? Jesus or Luther? Did I give it away by writing Jesus first? Right. Here's the really important thing, and this is C.S. Lewis, Mere Christianity, so I did not make this up. Mere Christianity is this beautiful book that C.S. Lewis wrote that came from his radio talks during World War II when Britain was being bombed. He does these talks on the Christian faith. And what he does is he talks about the essentials of the Christian faith, like what it means to be Christian. And in his introduction, he's got this beautiful introduction where he talks about the Christian faith as like this hallway, right? And off the hallway, you have these different doors that all have different rooms you can go into, right? But in the hallway is just Jesus. And the whole premise of his book is, he's like, I want to get you into the hallway. But off the hallway, you have these different rooms. And in these different rooms, you have different groups of people. Like you have the Lutherans, and you have the Anabaptists, and you have the Catholics. And he says, so in Mere Christianity, he's like, I want to deal with the hallway, and I want to get you in the hallway. But eventually, you'll pick a room. And it's not that this room is better than this room, which as Lutherans, we oftentimes say, well, that's not right. This room is better than this room. But rather what it is where are you able to connect and grow in who Jesus is? Like, no one room is perfect. Hear that one more time, Lutherans. No one room is perfect, right? We have advantages and we have disadvantages. And maybe not even disadvantages is the wrong word. We have things that we're really strong with and things that we're a little weaker on. And that's why it's important to remember this isn't just a house with rooms, it's a family, right? And different parts of the family bring different things in. So like I firmly believe, and one of the reasons I'm still Lutheran, is because I believe we have the best theology for reaching the lost. Here's why. We've held so strongly and tightly to the gospel. Saved by grace through faith. Nothing you can do, right? The other thing that we've got going for us is this little doctrine we call the doctrine of the hidden and revealed God. Why is this so important? Because we as Lutherans have a deep understanding that because God is who he is, and he is so big, there are going to be aspects of God we can never know. The hidden things of God. Luther used to call it the masks, right? And when you try and peer into the hidden things of God, you pull off one mask, what do you find? Another mask. So what do you do when you're dealing with this hidden God that you can't understand? You turn to the God that you can understand, the revealed God. And so what that allows us to do as Lutherans, because of our understanding of grace, because of our understanding of hidden revealed God, and because of our firm stance on sola scriptura, we're able to look as Christians and say it's just about Scripture, right? And faith in Jesus. We're able to say the Bible says this, so I can say this. The Bible doesn't say this, so I'm not going to speak to that. And so what it allows us to do is not create theological tensions that shouldn't exist. And in some other forms of faith, people try to wrap things up that don't easily wrap up, and they create problems and issues that lost people can very easily see, even though they can't quite articulate it. And so we have this tension where we're able to look and say, I don't know. We're the people that should be able to walk into the room in the midst of a tragedy that everybody's going, this is terrible, why did this happen? And we're not the ones that are going to look across from somebody and go, well, probably because you're not really that great a person. That's why that happened to you. Like, Lutherans would never say that. You know what we'd say? I don't know, this is terrible. But if you're in the midst of, like, losing a child, like, I don't know, it's terrible, I can't give you a good reason, I can pray with you, but I can also tell you you have a God that understands you who gave his child up. So it's like, can't understand the hidden God, but I can move to the revealed God, right? And then also, and this is the thing that we don't lean into enough as Lutherans, we have an incredible missional flexibility baked into the very core of our doctrine. Because in Augsburg Confession 7 and 8, yes, I broke out the Augsburg Confession. In Augsburg Confession 7 and 8, it says that our theology boils down to word and sacrament. That's it. Luther used to say, we have different kinds of masses so that we can reach and connect with different kinds of people, right? And so what that means is simply this. We as Lutherans can strip things down to the very essentials, take those essentials, place them into a new community, and then build worship and the church around those essentials in a way that's also very contextual. So like, because we're Lutherans, when the Lutherans migrated from Germany to the Americas, they realized, hey, we can preach in English. It doesn't have to be German. Why? Because it's just word and sacrament, right? We can speak in the language of the people. We don't take advantage of this enough, which I think leads into our second question. But before we do that, a much healthier way to think about differences between denominations is to look at your brothers and sisters in Christ in another denomination and say to yourself, what things can I learn from you that I could not learn from my own tribe? So for example, the first night we talked about a lot of different forms of prayer. I did not learn those in the Lutheran tribe. Because when it comes to prayer, we actually, like if you look at the big, thick Book of Concord, there's like a really small section on prayer. And it's in the large catechism. And I remember looking at that going, I need more, please. What I found out was, oh man, it was from actually a Baptist theologian that I learned how to pray scripture. And it was from some of the Jesuits that I learned about the examen prayer and some of these spiritual practices that help you connect with God. And it's like I had avoided some of those things because when you read through the confessions, what do you read? Well, the Anabaptists are wrong, and here's why they're wrong, right? And the Catholics are wrong, and here's why they're wrong, and monasticism is wrong, and here's why it's wrong. Well, let's keep in mind the context. They lived in a context where God was the center, and that was not taken for granted. They lived in a context that was more culturally Christian than what we could even imagine or dream of, right? And so they were able to look at nuances of faith and kind of argue about those things. We don't live in that. But we live in a culture where we can look and say, okay, you're a brother and sister in Christ, and when it comes to the core essentials of the faith, you're in, right? When we go to heaven, you're going to go to heaven with the Baptists, and you're going to go to heaven with Catholics, and Russian Orthodox and Eastern Orthodox and, non-denominational and Pentecostal, and it's going to be a big party, right? So what we can do here and now today is we can look at those different tribes and we can say, what good things can I learn from you? And what good things can I share with the greater tribe? And so that's kind of how I'd encourage you to think about that question. But then the other thing is, the other piece of that question, if I'm remembering it correctly, was we talked about the denominations. What was part two of that question? Remind me one more time.
What about the denominations? Because a lot of young people seem to be at least attracted very much to the whole Anabaptist movement.
Mm-hmm.
And shy away from anything that's what they call mainline, and their big thing is what they call the universal baptism.
Oh, yes. The theological distinctives, yeah. So I would say, sorry. She was saying that like a lot of young people today, it appears, kind of gravitate more toward the Anabaptist kind of stuff. And like believers' baptism and things like that. And so what are we supposed to do? Because that's like really counter to our understanding of baptism and theology. I would think one thing. I think anytime we're in a spot where we say, all people in this specific group do this, we're missing a little bit. Because it's a universal generalization, and universal generalizations generally aren't true. So like, for example, there are young people that gravitate toward and are very passionate about Lutheran theology. But here's the other trick to that, is oftentimes we're looking at the young people in the church, but what's the big thing that we're talking about? People outside the church. People that aren't connected to Jesus. And that comes to that second part of the question I also remembered, which is you've got Luther or you have Jesus, right? The question becomes, which came first, so which should I share first? Right. But sometimes as Lutherans, what we do, I'll never forget sitting down with a pastor, and we were having a good discussion together because he was wrestling with the fact, we were in the same community, he was wrestling in the fact that my church started in a movie theater, and I wore jeans and a t-shirt, not flip-flops, but that's a toes thing, not a fashion thing. And, all that kind of stuff. And, we would text in questions, and he's like, that doesn't look Lutheran, because what he would do is he would wear the robe in the traditional sanctuary, right, with all that stuff. And I said, okay, well, here's why I'm doing this. Because I want to connect with lost people where they are, and I want to share Jesus first. So like even the name of our church didn't say Lutheran, even though we were very clear about the fact that we were Lutheran. Whereas the name of his church said First Lutheran. So they were very clear about the fact that they were not only Lutheran, but they were the first ones there. Okay? And so I remember having this conversation, and I said, we got down to this core of this question right here. And I said, but I want to share Jesus. He goes, I want them to know what it means to be Lutheran first, and when they know what it means to be Lutheran, they'll understand Jesus. And I think, and you can argue with me on this, I think that's backwards. Because if I believe in Luther, I got nothing. If I believe in Jesus, I have everything, right? And even Luther would say that. I think Luther would be offended that there's a big statue of him at a seminary. He'd be like, why is that up there? Because even Luther would share what first? Jesus first. But then what you start to learn from sharing Jesus first is that the other reason Lutheran theology is the best for reaching the lost is Lutheran theology is flat out common sense. It's like you read Scripture and you can naturally get to Lutheran theology on your own. In fact, that's why my friend Trey, who did not grow up Lutheran, who came back to faith in a Baptist church, became the worship leader of a Lutheran church. And the first thing he did is he read our theology and he goes, oh, this is good. And then later down the road, a few years later, he ends up in a Lutheran seminary. Now he's a Lutheran pastor because he loves Lutheran theology because of all the reasons I shared with you. So if you're talking about people from outside the church, don't worry about different theological distinctives because they just don't know Jesus. And so the first thing they need to connect with is Jesus. And then after they connect with Jesus, they will connect with the different veins of Christianity, whether you're talking about Lutheran, or you're talking about Baptist, or you're talking about, Catholic, or you're talking about, non-denom, which is not a denomination that's become a denomination. It's kind of funny that way, right? But at the end of the day, and this is the difference, I think this is the difference of the culture we're living in and the culture we came out of. The culture that we came out of, I remember talking to a guy, I was doing his wife's funeral. They've been married, like 60 years, right? And when they first got together, he was Lutheran and she was Catholic, which back then did not happen, right? And he told me a story, it really sticks out to me. He said when they first met, the priests in New Jersey called the priests where he was from in Iowa. And those priests went to his parents' house and interviewed them to figure out how he was raised and what they believed, and then reported back to the priests in New Jersey, right? It was a big deal because that was a culture where so many people were Christian, it mattered if a Lutheran married a non-Lutheran, right? We don't live in that culture anymore. We don't live in a culture where church is at the center. I live in a culture where as my kids grow up, I'm teaching them everything I can teach them about the faith, and I'm teaching them from this theological distinctive right here because I believe it's the best, but I believe it's the best for me and my understanding of Christianity and for my kids' faith. But if they grow up and they love Jesus, but they decide to go to the non-denominational church down the street because they're able to better grow in their faith there and connect with Jesus, then I'm 100% behind that. Because at the end of the day, I want them connected here first and foremost. And what this also does, it gives us a radical ability to partner in ways that we wouldn't have partnered in the past. Because sometimes, and this is kind of another side note, this is a tangent, I apologize, but you all asked the question. I think sometimes people outside the church have a better picture of what the church is supposed to be than people inside the church. And I would say it this way, because when a scandal breaks out, right, and it hits the news, people outside the church are going, oh man, look at what the church did. And people inside of the church are going, no, that's just those Catholics, or those Baptists, or those non-denoms. It wasn't us Lutherans. And we look and we go, aren't you all Christian? Yeah. Because they realize that even Jesus said we are one. He wants us to be one as he and the Father are one. And so sometimes what we need to do is we need to realize these are important, but they're important in certain places and they're not as important in others. And so we need to remember it all starts and stems from Jesus. And I think the reason we have different denominations and different churches is because different churches reach different people. And we want all kinds of people to come to faith in Jesus. And if you're like, that sounds like a wrestling match, guess what? It was a wrestling match in the book of Acts too, right? Because what are we going to do with all these Gentiles that have come into the church? They don't know how to keep kosher, right? This was an issue they wrestled with. But at the end of the day, they went back to what? Here's Jesus. Here's the gospel. Here's how we move forward with that. Yeah, really, really good question. Yeah. Any other questions sticking out to you?
I have, this is the text I was trying to dig up before lunch. I know and trust that God will lead us in the conversations, but I still feel inadequate.
I get that, 100%. It's funny, that happens to us in a lot of areas of life. I listen to a lot of leadership talks, and there's actually a theory in leadership called the imposter syndrome, where we're in a spot or a position, and we feel like we don't know why we're there, or we shouldn't be there, and so we feel like we're an imposter, right? And the same can be true with sharing our faith for multiple reasons. Like one, we sometimes feel hypocritical when we share our faith because we know these are things that we still wrestle with, right? And so there's that. But then there's definitely the spot where we're like, man, I don't think I'm good enough to do this. And here's the quick thing, you don't have to be. Like, you don't have to be because Jesus is always enough. And if you feel that way, chances are even the people around you, like some of the pastors leading your churches, have felt that way too. Like I remember my last year of seminary, I came back from seminary, I got done with my vicarage, it was a lot of fun. And I remember coming back from my vicarage and sitting down, and so it was my last year of seminary, so it was time to think about that first call and where I would go and what kind of ministry I would do. And I remember sitting down in that instance with my home church, and I said, I think I could go to a bigger home church like the one we were from, and I think I could be one pastor on a staff with several others, and I think I'd be able to do that. And I said, after vicarage, I really think I could go to a smaller church too and be like a sole pastor, and I think I'd be able to do that. I said, the one thing I don't think I can do is church plant or be a missionary. I'm not going to do that. And my home pastors looked at me and they said, really? They said, we think you should do that. And I was like, no, I'm not going to do that. My vicarage supervisor at the same time was calling the seminary and saying that. And so it started this year-long process. I only went to the church plant assessment because my friend Joe was going, and he didn't like to do things by himself. So he would always bring a friend around, and I was the friend that he brought. And then I passed whatever test they gave us, and so they're like, come to the church plant assessment center. And I remember going to this 4-day weekend thing, and they're like, at the end of this weekend, we'll tell you whether you should church plant or not. So I said, okay, God, this kind of sounds like you. So whatever you say at the end of this weekend, I'm going to do. Went through the whole weekend. At the end of the weekend, they looked at me and they said, we think you should plant a church. And I said, absolutely not. I will not do that. We get to the end of the call time, and we had this really great call supervisor guy, Dr. Hayner. And he pulls me into his office, and he says, Matt, I need you to make a decision because you're holding up my process. You have to decide which of these 3 calls you feel like God's leading you to. One was to Fargo, North Dakota, but the second call was to be one staff on a pastor with several, on a bigger church staff, where I got to start my own worship service. And it was in a place, Omaha, Nebraska, which, yes, I know is in the middle of the Midwest, and many of you are going, where in the world is Omaha, Nebraska? It's like the middle of nowhere, but it just happened to be the place that a lot of my undergraduate friends had moved and lived. So it was a place where I had a big base of friendships in a role that I felt like I could do pretty well. And then I had this other call to go to a church plant training center for like 6 months to a year and then plant a church somewhere that I wasn't quite sure which city it was going to be in. And I was like thinking in my dorm room, and all of a sudden I realized I feel like I can do those first things really well. I know I can't do the last one. But I know that's also where I'm going to grow the most in my faith. And if I can't do that, then God has to show up. And that's where you see cool things happen. And so it was actually that feeling of not being able to do it and enough that pulled me into church planting and sent me on the journey that's been a blast that I would never change for anything. And I think sometimes it's that not feeling like you're enough that can pull you into the most exciting journeys of faith. You just have to be willing to give it a shot and trust that God will be there. But when you step out beyond what you know how to do, God will show up. Especially when you're doing the thing he's already asked you to do. It's like when my kids come up to me and they need help with something and it's something I've asked them to do. Am I like, no, I'm not going to help you. You're going to figure that out on your own, right? No, I'm like, I will gladly help you do the thing I've already asked you to do because you want to do it. And I think that's where we have to be sometimes. Yeah. Cool. Any other questions from these last sessions? These are good questions, by the way. Cool. All right. She was saying, do you find it helpful to have something like one of those little booklets that's like steps to faith and stuff like that to be able to leave with somebody after they've had a conversation, after you've had a conversation or something like that? Is that something that would be helpful? And my answer is yes and no. And it's going to be yes sometimes and no sometimes. And you'll know that right time. So like, I really do believe those things can be helpful. I actually, at our church, I was looking for one that fit our theology, and I couldn't find one, like a little 1-week devotional like You're New to Faith. And so I just wrote one for our church that kind of fit our theology and walked people through the gospel and then living out faith. And yeah, I would hand that out to people when the time felt right. But sometimes it's not always right. And I think the tension that you lean into is sometimes it's helpful, but you also don't want somebody to feel like you're just giving them some prefab thing. And so there'll be moments where that's the perfect thing to give, and having some on hand would be really helpful. And then giving them something that's like, hey, if you've got questions, you can ask questions. And then other times it's not helpful. So like, I have this guy I know who was walking through a tougher time and needed to work on forgiveness, and somebody had mailed him a book on forgiveness. And he was like, oh, that's pretty cool. It's coming from a Christian perspective. But as he read it, it was helpful at first, but then not so helpful. But it became a catalyst where we could have a conversation. So at the end of the day, was the book helpful? Yeah, I think so. It opened up a door for us to talk about forgiveness and Jesus and to be able to share other things that might be more helpful. So yeah, there's going to be moments. I think just like trust the Holy Spirit, and if you feel that little nudge to leave something, leave it. And if you don't. But I think don't feel like you have to, but also don't feel like you never should. Is that, yeah. Good, very good question, yeah. Cool. Can you share that? Yes, I think I can send you the PDF. Yeah, I'll send the PDF over to you. Yeah. Cool. Any other questions? Awesome. All right, so I tell you what, we're going to do a coffee break because it's afternoon coffee time / decaf, whatever you want to do. And then after we have the coffee time, what we're going to do is we're going to step into something. Oh, yeah. We'll put up the next slide. We're going to step into where do we go from here?